Hello, everybody, and welcome to our introductory lesson on the major novel that we'll be covering from now until the end of the first trimester. I hope that you have either downloaded your copy of A Separate Piece or that you've brought in a hard copy of the book. But today we're actually going to begin discussing a little bit of the background that involves the book, and then ultimately we'll take a look at the opening chapter. We'll divide the reading assignments into sections so that we'll probably wind up tackling chapters 1 to 3, which will be due on Monday, and then 4 to 6, and then 7 to 9, and then 10 to 13. That's not to imply that we're only having 4 lessons on the book, because you'll discover that once we start getting into the chapters, it'll probably take more than one class period just to discuss the groupings as they appear above. A Separate Piece is probably John Knowles' most famous novel, with the exception of maybe The French Lieutenant's Woman. And there's a good amount of Knowles' life that is contained within the confines of the book. He was born in West Virginia, almost like the character that we're going to meet in our story. And Knowles himself attended an all-boys prep school, Phillips Exeter in New Hampshire, very elite boarding school in New England. When he published A Separate Piece, it was pretty clear that a good portion of the story reflected the experiences that he wound up having in school when he was there, including the fact that at the time when he was attending the school, the United States was immersed in World War II. So we have in the title A Separate Piece, and obviously there's something that the title's going to have to deal in some way, shape, or form with the characters, but also when we think about the backdrop of World War II, we probably can understand that we're talking about war on many levels, not just the external enormous war that involved many, many countries, but we're also maybe going to talk about wars that exist between people on a personal level and wars that exist on an internal level within a human being himself. So the setting of the story is going to be the summer of 1942. And the boys are going to be staying on campus and taking some summer session courses. So the early years of America's involvement in World War II is the setting of our novel. It's a time when a lot of young men who were in high school faced a very difficult decision. Should they enlist in the Army or should they wait to be drafted? The benefit of enlisting is that you were able to choose what kind of branch of the military you would go into. If you waited to be drafted, it was kind of a random selection, and you could get thrown into any particular version, any particular point or part of the military. Again, this may seem very foreign to you guys, but a 16-year-old young man is on the cusp of almost going into war, okay? So we kind of have to step outside of ourselves to appreciate that. And yet, the story itself is not going to take place overseas. It's not going to take place in Germany or in Europe or anything like that. It's actually going to take place during this summer of 1942 at this prep school in New Hampshire called the Devon School. It's an all-boys prep school for young men in New Hampshire. The characters in the novel are definitely based on classmates that Knowles had when he was a student. He admits that readily. And as we begin in summer, eventually the summer is going to turn to the fall, and there'll be inner conflicts and inner struggles that each character is going to experience and decisions that they're going to have to make, these sort of battles that must be faced on an individual level. The attack on Pearl Harbor was December 7th, 1941, so when you think about the fact that we're dealing with the summer of 42, it's less than a year after the start of the war. The draft age at that point was lowered to 18. Many people didn't want to be drafted. Many people didn't wait to be drafted, I should say. They were kind of eager. There was this sort of patriotism that was running rampant throughout the country and a lot of people just thought that they wanted to get involved right away, as soon as they could. They felt it was their duty to enlist. So the times, you could say, were very different than the times living now. Americans all bought in. They did everything they could to aid this country. They would attend rallies, they bought war bonds, they conserved fuel, they dealt with rationing of materials, other shortages, and they did it for the duration. That became the expression that, we could basically suck it up and deal with it for the duration until the end of the war. Even the posters you can see here, do with less so they will have enough. Okay, so rationing gives you your fair share. So we want to save what we can so we can send it to our boys. And when you ride alone in the car, you're riding with Hitler. In other words, carpool, share, conserve gas, all those kinds of things. The story is going to involve a couple of different young men. Number one, we're going to have a first-person narrator. And our narrator is a young man named Gene Forrester. And as you will see from chapter 1, the story is told in the form of a flashback. So the events that he's going to tell are events that have occurred a long time ago, 15 years ago to be exact. So it's now, I guess, 1957 or somewhere around there, and Gene has decided to come back and visit. So he has returned to the Devon School campus after an absence of 15 years. And he's come there because he wants to see certain things. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm just going to the first page of chapter 1. The I tells us that we're talking about a first-person narrator. I went back to the Devon School not long ago and found it looking oddly newer than when I was a student there 15 years before. It seemed more sedate than I remembered it, more perpendicular and straight-laced, with narrower windows and shinier woodwork, as though a great coat of varnish had been put over everything for better preservation. But of course, 15 years before, there had been a war going on. Perhaps the school wasn't as well kept up in those days. Perhaps varnish, along with everything else, had gone to war. I didn't entirely like this glossy new surface because it made the school look like a museum, and that's exactly what it was to me, and what I did not want it to be. In the deep, tacit way in which feeling becomes stronger than thought, I had always felt that the Devon School came into existence the day I entered it. It was vibrantly real while I was a student there, and then blinked out like a candle the day I left. Now here it was, after all, preserved by some considerate hand with varnish and wax. Preserved along with it, like stale air in an unopened room, was the well-known fear which had surrounded and filled those days. So much of it I hadn't even known was there. Because unfamiliar with the absence of fear and what that was like, I had not been able to identify its presence. Looking back now across 15 years, I could see with great clarity the fear I had lived in, which must mean that in the interval I had succeeded in a very important undertaking. I must have made my escape from it. I felt fear's echo, and along with that I felt the unhinged, uncontrollable joy which had been its accompaniment and opposite face, joy which had broken out sometimes in those days like northern lights across the black sky. There were a couple of places now I wanted to see. Both were fearful sights, and that was why I wanted to see them. So after lunch at the Devon Inn, I walked back toward the school. It was a raw, nondescript time of year, toward the end of November, the kind of wet, self-pitying November day when every speck of dirt stands out clearly. Devon, luckily, had very little of such weather. The icy clamp of winter or the radiant New Hampshire summers were more characteristic of it. But this day, it blew wet, moody gusts all around me. Okay, so I'm going to leave you to your annotations. You're going to be looking at chapters 1 to 3. If I were you and I'm looking just at that first page, I would definitely be alert to this idea of fear. He mentions it in the third paragraph here. Some kind of fear that surrounded him every single day he was at that prep school. And now that he's back and he doesn't feel the fear, something must have happened in the interim for him to extricate himself from that crippling feeling. So good luck with your reading, and with the remaining time in the class, just dive in and keep going. What you will do is you will annotate 4 paragraphs, any 4, in each chapter, and that's going to be your homework assignment instead of doing questions or chapter summaries or anything like that. I really want you to pick out passages that seem to resonate with you. Okay? Thank you for your attention and good luck.